Autumn 1793. France is collapsing under the weight of her own revolution. The king has fallen to the guillotine. In Paris, extremists rule by fear, executing thousands in the name of liberty. Across the countryside, whole regions rise against the Republic, unwilling to bow to the new order. And on her borders, the greatest powers of Europe close in, determined to strangle this dangerous experiment in freedom before it spreads. Then comes a blow more devastating than any lost battle. In the south, the port of Toulon turns traitor. France's largest naval base on the Mediterranean, home to a third of her fleet, throws open its gates not to Paris, not to the Republic, but to its oldest enemies. Into the harbor sails the Royal Navy under Admiral Lord Hood, with Spanish, Neapolitan, and Sardinian allies at his side. Without firing a shot, the Republic loses control of the sea, and with it, perhaps the war. The government in Paris cannot afford such humiliation. If Toulon is not taken back, the revolution itself may not survive. 19,000 men are rushed south to lay siege to the rebel stronghold. But there is a problem. France has soldiers. France has courage. What it does not have is leadership. Aristocrats once filled the officer corps, but they are gone, fled abroad, or fed to the blade of the guillotine. Now, the army is commanded by men of loyalty, but not of skill. General Jean-François Carteau leads the besieging army. Before the revolution, he painted portraits in oils. Now he paints orders of battle. His few professional officers are wounded or dead, and the one branch of the army most vital to a siege, its artillery, lies in chaos. Too few cannon, too little powder, not enough trained men to fire them. Amid this crisis, a name surfaces. A Corsican lieutenant colonel, only 24 years old, scarcely tested in war. But he carries himself with assurance, and his politics are unimpeachable. In the chaos of the revolution, those two qualities matter more than reputation. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. The Siege of Toulon will be his first real command, and his first step onto the stage of history. Toulon was no ordinary city. Perched on France's southern coast, it was the Republic's gateway to the Mediterranean, a fortress of stone walls and naval docks. Inside its harbors rested more than 20 ships of the line, the lifeblood of French sea power. When its leaders chose to side with the rebels, they did more than betray Paris. They delivered France's fleet into the hands of her enemies. By August, Admiral Lord Hood's British flagship, HMS Victory, anchored proudly in the port. Alongside it rode the squadrons of Spain, Naples, and Sardinia. In one stroke, France's rivals had gained a stronghold on her coast and crippled her navy. The blow reverberated through every corner of the Republic. If Toulon remained in Allied hands, the revolution itself might collapse. The few professionals under him fared no better. Colonel Martin, commander of artillery, was badly wounded before the siege began. Without him, the most vital arm of any siege, its guns, was reduced to chaos. Cannon sat idle for lack of crews. Powder and shot were scarce. No plan existed to break Toulon's ring of defenses. It was then that a Corsican deputy in the convention, Antoine Salicetti, offered a solution. A young artillery officer, passing through on his way to the front. 24 years old, sharp in bearing, relentless in conviction, and above all, committed to the Republic. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. Until now, Bonaparte had seen little active service, but he arrived at Toulon with something rarer than experience: clarity. He understood at once that artillery would decide the siege. Without guns, the Republican army would bleed itself dry against Toulon's walls. With them, it could strangle the harbor, drive out the enemy fleet, and force the city to submit. On September 16th, 1793, Bonaparte was given command of the artillery. Around him lay shortages, confusion, and inexperience. To most men, an impossible task. To Napoleon, the first real chance to prove himself. When Napoleon took command of the artillery, he inherited almost nothing. A handful of guns scattered across the lines, few trained gunners, shortages of powder, shot, and carriages. In truth, the Republic's army outside Toulon had numbers, but not the tools to break a fortress. Napoleon's response was relentless energy. He scoured nearby villages for unused cannon, requisitioned them from local arsenals, and pulled rusting pieces back into service. Infantrymen, who had never fired a gun in their lives, were drilled as artillery crews. A forge and workshop were set up behind the lines, where smiths hammered out shot and repaired carriages. From Marseille, he arranged the transport of 100,000 sandbags to build new batteries. Within weeks, the transformation was astonishing. The young Corsican gathered 64 officers, 1,500 men, and nearly 100 cannon, howitzers, and mortars. It was not the army he had been given, it was the army he had created. Then came the positioning. Bonaparte knew Toulon's harbor was the key. The Allied fleet was the lifeline of the city. If he could place guns where they could reach the inner anchorage, Admiral Hood would be forced to withdraw. He ordered 2 new forward batteries built on high ground, christened with revolutionary names, La Montagne and Sans-Culotte. From here, his guns hurled shot into Toulon's inner harbor, forcing Hood to shift his ships closer to the docks. Under increasing pressure, it was the first proof that artillery, well placed and well served, could strangle a port city more effectively than any infantry assault. But Napoleon's ambition did not stop at harassment. He had already sketched a bolder plan. Seize the fort of L'Aiguillette, perched on the peninsula that dominated Toulon's waters. If the French could take it and mount heavy guns, they could rain fire on the Allied fleet at anchor. Toulon would become a trap, and the British would be forced to abandon the city. It was a clear, decisive idea, the kind of thinking the Republic desperately needed. For the first time, a 24-year-old officer from Corsica had shown Paris that he was more than a soldier. He was a strategist. On September 22, 1793, Napoleon's plan was put to the test. He had urged an assault with 3,000 men on the heights overlooking Toulon. Capture that ground, seize Fort L'Aiguillette, and the Allied fleet would be at his mercy. But General Carteau hesitated. He committed not 3,000 but 400. Brave men, but too few. They advanced against Montcaire under withering fire and were quickly repulsed. The attack accomplished nothing except to reveal Bonaparte's intentions to the enemy. The Allies moved with speed. Within 48 hours, thousands of reinforcements climbed the same heights, digging trenches, building earthworks, and raising a new fortress bristling with cannon. They called it Fort Mulgrave. To the French soldiers staring up from below, it was instantly christened with another name, Little Gibraltar. The opportunity Napoleon had seen so clearly was slipping away. Instead of a vulnerable hilltop, the French now faced a bastion guarded by 20 heavy guns, defended by British regulars, Spanish infantry, and sailors turned soldiers from Admiral Hood's fleet. Through October, the siege dragged on. French troops, underfed and poorly supplied, dug trenches and endured constant bombardment. Skirmishes flared along the lines, but the decisive blow never came. The siege risked grinding into stalemate, or worse, collapse. Then, in mid-November, a change in command. General Dugommier arrived to take charge of the French army. Unlike Carteau, he was a professional soldier, experienced, decisive, and willing to listen. He studied the ground, consulted his young artillery major, and immediately recognized the truth. Bonaparte's plan remained the only path to victory. With Dugommier's backing, the work began anew. More batteries were raised, their guns hauled forward at night under cover of darkness. One, so exposed to enemy fire that men refused to serve it, was renamed by Bonaparte himself. La Batterie des Hommes sans peur, the battery of men without fear. The name alone was enough. Volunteers came forward, eager to prove they deserved the title. For the first time, the French army outside Toulon began to believe, and at its heart was a 24-year-old Corsican, already showing the gift that would define his rise, the power to inspire men to follow him into fire. By late November, Bonaparte's guns had closed in around Toulon. Battery after battery hammered the Allied lines, forcing the Royal Navy to edge ever closer to the docks. The Allies knew they had to act or be strangled into submission. On 30th November, the initiative fell to General Charles O'Hara, commander of the Allied land forces. A veteran of America's War of Independence, he had once surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown. O'Hara now sought redemption in France. At dawn, under cover of heavy cannon fire, he led a strike force against the French batteries threatening Fort Malbosquet. The attack struck like thunder. French gunners were caught off guard. Several redoubts were stormed, cannons spiked, crews scattered. For a moment, the lines buckled, and O'Hara seemed on the verge of breaking the siege. But Dugommier and Bonaparte reacted with speed. Gathering reserves, they launched a furious counterattack. Napoleon himself rode with the second wave, directing men into the fire. Musket balls snapped through the air, and smoke clung to the hillside. Amid the chaos, Bonaparte's horse went down beneath him, killed outright. Moments later, a British sergeant lunged with a bayonet. The blade tore into Napoleon's thigh. The wound came within inches of severing an artery and ending his story before it began. Dragged clear by his men, Bonaparte refused to leave the field. Bloodied but unbroken, he urged the assault forward. French infantry surged through the smoke, outnumbering O'Hara's men. The Allies were thrown back. In the melee, O'Hara himself was shot through the hand and captured. It was a bitter humiliation. 12 years earlier, he had surrendered to Washington in America. Now, fate forced him to yield again, this time to a little-known Corsican major. The failed counterattack was a turning point. French morale soared. The Allies had gambled on breaking the siege and lost. And for Bonaparte, the battle scar on his leg would remain a reminder of how close history had come to losing him on the slopes outside Toulon. In the early hours of 18th December, 1793, the Republicans prepared their decisive strike. Wind howled in from the sea. Rain lashed across the trenches, turning the ground to mud. Under cover of darkness, thousands of French troops assembled for the assault on Fort Mulgrave, Little Gibraltar, the fortress the Allies believed unassailable. At the signal, the French surged forward. Muskets, soaked by the storm, misfired or failed entirely. Soldiers swung them as clubs or fixed bayonets and charged headlong into the defenses. The first wave was thrown back in savage hand-to-hand fighting. Then came the second wave, led by Major Bonaparte himself. Limping from his earlier wound, he pressed on through the storm. Cannon roared point blank, grape shot tore gaps in the ranks, but the French kept climbing. Bonaparte directed batteries to fire at close range, smashing breaches into the outer works. Dugommier pushed men into the gap. The battle became chaos, bayonets, sabers, and bare hands deciding life or death atop the ramparts. Napoleon's horse was shot dead beneath him. Allied officers rallied their men, desperate to hold the line. But the pressure was relentless. By dawn, the Allied garrison was overwhelmed. Fort Mulgrave had fallen. The effect was immediate. French guns were dragged up onto the captured heights. By afternoon, 10 heavy cannon were in place at Fort Leguillet, commanding the entire harbor. From here, the Allied fleet at anchor lay under the sights of Bonaparte's artillery. Admiral Hood faced the impossible. To remain was to see Britain's and Spain's ships shattered at anchor. He ordered an evacuation. Fires lit the sky as Allied sailors tried to destroy the French fleet and dockyards before fleeing. But in the chaos, 18 ships of the line slipped back into Republican hands. In the streets of Toulon, panic erupted. Thousands of civilians, terrified of Republican vengeance, swarmed to the harbor, begging for passage aboard British and Spanish ships. 14,000 escaped into the night. Others drowned in the crush. Many more were left behind to face the wrath of the revolution. For the Allies, Toulon had become disaster. For the Republic, it was salvation. And for a young artillery officer from Corsica, it was the first undeniable proof of genius. At dawn, Republican troops marched into Toulon. What followed was not liberation, but retribution. For 2 weeks, the guillotine and the firing squads worked without pause. Nearly 200 were executed each day. Allied propaganda later claimed Bonaparte himself directed the bloodshed, but there is no evidence of his hand. His role had been the guns, and the victory they had made possible. For the Republic, Toulon was more than a triumph. It was survival. A blow that might have broken France had been turned aside. The British fleet, once master of the harbor, had been driven out. The revolution, for all its chaos, had endured. And for the young Corsican artillery officer, the reward was swift. Promoted to brigadier general, Napoleon Bonaparte had carved his name into history for the first time. At 24 years old, he had shown the qualities that would define his rise: clarity of vision, relentless energy, and the will to inspire men to follow him into fire. Toulon was only the beginning. Ahead lay 21 years of almost unbroken war years in which Europe would tremble at the sound of his name. But here, on the hills above the Mediterranean, amid mud, blood, and cannon smoke, Bonaparte's path had begun. History turns on moments. A single night assault, a single wound survived, a single decision made. Toulon was one such moment. If you found this story compelling, let us know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Could the revolution have survived without Toulon? And if Napoleon had fallen on that hillside, how different might Europe's future have been? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Epic History Chronicles. Ring the bell so you never miss the battles and empires that shaped our world. The story of Napoleon has only just begun, and many more turning points await.